the Chancellor at the RA. I know we all stand in a long line and are doing our best to be worthy of that line and take that line further into the future. I also want to say what a pleasure it is for me personally to be here. You know, I look around the room and there are many people who are now my friends, who I didn't know the first time I spoke to you 6 years ago, 5 years ago, and this is one of the best parts of being the head of JTS, is to be part of this incredible group of rabbis doing the work day in and day out. We might call it the Vayikra style work, which supports our community and keeps it going and supports the values which I hold dear. You make the job of Chancellor a lot less lonely. You know, we are a small number of us in the world. The Jews are a shrinking percentage of the world population. In absolute terms, we're not doing a great job with numbers either. And the Jews who care about the Jewish people or Judaism or Torah is also not a large number and not getting larger despite Orthodox birth rate. And the number of those who walk the path of Torah more or less the way we do as conservative Jews or as members of what I call the vital religious center is also not a large number. And we need each other. We rely on the gifts that we bring to this task, the work that we do every day, which is not only keeping things going, but inspiring. There's so much good going on out there, and one of the privileges of being Chancellor of JTS is I get to go around the country and visit schools and shuls and Hillel foundations and other places where RA members are at work, and I get to see not only dedication, but imagination, creativity, sometimes brilliance, in translating a tradition into everyday life, in everyday terms that people can understand, relate to, find compelling, find joyful, find profound. There are just not a lot of people out there committed, as we are, as Vayikra is, I think, to this notion that ethics matters as well as ritual matters, that thought matters as well as practice, that fidelity to the past matters, but so does thorough involvement in the joys and dilemmas of the present. And you all, I know, have my back as we take this path of Torah forward. I hope you know that I have your back, that we are in this together. We're in this together for a project that I find a very hopeful, optimistic project, despite declining numbers. But I look at the quality, I look at the successes, I feel that we are doing the right things, and if we keep doing these right things and do them with imagination and boldness, that we will succeed. And finally, I want to say what a pleasure it is to thank Julie for the level of cooperation between JTS and the RA that is evidenced in the JTS continuing education track at this year's RA convention. It's really a joy for JTS and the RA to work together. Again, one of the pleasures of my job comes behind the scenes, feeling that we can do good with other people who are really out there doing good along the same path that we are. It means a lot to me personally, and I wanted you to know that this cooperation is happening. You don't always see it every day, but it is there, and it is a thing that is something to celebrate, I believe. What I want to talk about for the next few minutes is something that chancellors of the Jewish Theological Seminary have not characteristically talked about very much, and that is Jewish theology. Now, there are reasons why chancellors of JTS, and many of you experienced this in professors at JTS, did not talk about Jewish theology a whole lot. Finkelstein did. He was one of the exceptions. Schechter wrote a book, a well-known book, a great book called Aspects of Rabbinic Theology. Schechter himself did not talk about his own theology a whole lot, and that was because, Schechter told us, in my terms, he didn't believe what he wanted to believe. He had that image of what he called the old Adam, and he couldn't be that old Adam. And I think it was also true of a lot of JTS professors that they didn't have the belief that they wanted to have, and so preferred not to talk theology rather than say things that they didn't think were appropriate to carrying on their tradition. I happen to be a person who has loved theology for as long as I can remember. I am here today because assistant rabbi at Congregation Emmanuel in Philadelphia named Nachum Waldman, Zichrono Livracha, taught teenagers Heschel and Kaplan, and taught it theologically. When I went to college, I found myself a teacher who would teach me Protestant theology. I loved Kierkegaard and Barth and Bultmann and Tillich. This is the stuff of life to me. This is not abstraction. This is what makes life meaningful. It puts it in an ultimate context. And having celebrated the observant life last night, one of the things that we celebrate in this book is that it doesn't simply tell Jews what to do, it talks about the meaning of this doing. It links behavior to thinking. It constantly puts the emphasis not only on the doing, but on the meaning of the doing, on the practice, on the meaning of the practice. And it seems to me that there is something very important to us in theology. It's important for ourselves, those of us who care about it, need to nurture it in ourselves and one another. But also, I've come to believe, after years of teaching Jews and particularly teaching college students who are questing, who are searching, and then doing the work for the Jew within, the sort of empirical work among American Jews. Jews want to talk theology. Jews in particular want to talk about God. They want help in putting their life inside this larger frame of ultimate meaning, which is one of the great gifts, after all, of being a Jew. And why waste it? You have this tradition which makes you part of a people larger than yourself, which makes you part of an ultimate truth, an ultimate being, God larger than yourself. And you need help puzzling it out because you don't get to do this all the time. And I think we should not neglect theology. Believing, in other words, is not less important than behaving and belonging, as important as behaving and belonging are. I find this need for theology increasing with the news. And I don't want to oversimplify the news, but let me just say that my wife and I have a deal in the morning. She gets the front page of the New York Times. I get the sports section. I think I have the happier day. It's very dispiriting. It's very discouraging. For those of us who are out of work, it is positively oppressive to read about and feel in your bones the stalled American economy. And I have 2 kids in their 20s who are facing a job market which is non-existent for kids in their 20s. I have spoken to graduates of prestigious law schools who are looking for jobs, and there's no prospect of that industry recouping anytime soon what it lost about 3 or 4 years ago. We live in a time of incredible anxiety. It could be that any time is a time of anxiety, but it seems that the world situation right now is conspiring to make us anxious. We have an election which, without taking sides, let me just say, has not been lofty so far in its rhetoric and has no prospect of becoming more elevated in the months to come. We have a world situation with wars that don't seem to end. We have the prospect of Iran. I don't know how worrisome this is ultimately. We'll find out. God willing, there's going to be a solution to this. But you wake up in the morning, one more day there has not been a solution. It's a problem. It's worrisome. What's going to be here? You have a peace process in Israel. It doesn't seem to be much of a peace process. I remember when my father, close to death, told me very sadly they didn't think he was going to live to see peace in the Middle East. Sometimes I wonder if we live long lives, are going to live to see peace in the Middle East. And it's very discouraging. And so one needs the comfort and the strength that comes from connection to this larger picture, which practice gives one, yes, which belonging gives one, but which thought also gives one. Then I wanted to say a word about history. History sometimes seems at a distance, other times comes very close, and in the last couple weeks, with the quick sequence of Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron, and Yom HaAtzmaut, history in its greatness and its lowness seemed very, very close. And I find the need for the resources of Jewish thought to make sense of this in certain ways, particularly because other people are making sense of it in ways that I find, let's say, unacceptable, unappealing, or even abhorrent. I had the pleasure several weeks ago of being at a shul for Parashat Shmini, where the Bat Mitzvah gave a really intelligent Dvar Torah, wrestling with the deaths of Nadav and Abihu, coming to the conclusion that God could not have done this to punish those children for a ritual error, however serious. And she, in great humility, said at the end of the talk, there are things we can't understand. And I had the privilege of following her with my own Dvar Torah, and my Dvar Torah was precisely based on Vayidom Aharon. Moses has, I don't know what Moses is doing there. Maybe Moses is providing some sort of explanation. Maybe he's trying to provide comfort. Maybe he sees it as a teachable moment. Unfortunately, to my mind, most of our commentators seem to think that what Moses is saying is that God struck them down for a reason, and we're here to learn this reason so that we don't repeat the mistake. This might be okay. It's not good on a personal level, I don't think, but it might be okay, except for the frequent juxtaposition, as this year, between Parashat Shmini and Yom HaShoah. So you're talking to a scholar of contemporary Jewish thought, you're listening to a scholar of contemporary Jewish thought, whose field was for about 20 years, in the 70s and the 80s, dominated by what we call Holocaust theology. And I have to say, I don't think Holocaust theology did us very much good. I'm on the Heschel side, the Soloveitchik side of Hastarat Panim. Don't try to explain what you can't explain. Better to be silent than to say things like, God killed those Jews because God didn't like Reform Judaism or Zionism, which, as you know, is the viewpoint of the leader of a prominent Hasidic sect, or the fact that those Jews died and God allowed it to happen proved that God is dead, which was the verdict of one of the most important theological books to come out in the 1960s in American Judaism, a book of immense impact. So, if that is your choice, then I have to say I would prefer silence. Better humility in the face of what you can't understand. And I myself am drawn to Heschel's phrase in his essay, No Religion is an Island, we are not God's accountants. We cannot be God's accountants. And I understand the thanksgiving that one says on Yom HaAtzmaut. I understand the thanksgiving that I would have said in 1947 at that UN General Assembly vote, or that many people of John Lewis's community said when the Supreme Court decision came down about Brown versus Board of Education. That thanksgiving is not the same as saying, as Soloveitchik does in Kol Diddo Fake, that God was absent in the Holocaust, but in 1947 in that UN General Assembly, God was there behind that vote, and in 1956 Israel, and 1948 war, God was fighting alongside Israel, and in 1956 God was with Israel, etc., etc., etc. This kind of accounting, I think, is theologically very problematic. I understand why Rabbi Soloveitchik did this, but to my mind, we do better in a certain way with humility and silence and gratitude and blessing than we do with trying to be God's accountants. Jews need us to say what can be said and not to say things that are not helpful in these situations. Now I want to switch gears a little bit based on something I just said. Jews need us to say what can be said. In other words, the theological silence that many teachers at JTS and leaders of the conservative movement felt obliged to maintain needs to be broken as often as we can break it with the full measure of belief at our disposal. I learned a lesson myself about theology from Parshat Kitisa when Moses, in this high point of encounter with God, begs, to my reading, bursts out with Hareini na'at kvodecha. He knows this may be the only time in human history a human being gets to say this, gets to ask this, and so Moses asks Hareini na'at kvodecha. Moses wants to see the ultimate. Moses wants to know it. I like the explanation of that verse, which is Moses wanted to know how it's all going to turn out. When are the good going to be rewarded finally at the end of days? When are the wicked going to be punished? And God says you can't do this. And for a long time in my life, I focused on that no, on what could not be known. But I didn't appreciate the yeses, which are more important than the no. And what does Moses get at that very moment? Moses gets to be sheltered in the palm of God's hand. Moses gets assurance of God's presence. Moses knows viscerally on his body, he knows God's care. He knows God's concern. He is suffused with God's love. All of this, despite the fact that he can't know what he wants to know, but look at what he has. And the second thing he has is all of God's goodness passes before him. He gets to see the places where God has been in the world. He gets to see evidence of God's presence. He gets confirmation of the two most important attributes of God, God's justice and God's mercy, the two most important because we need those attributes in order to be God's partners in the world and work with the covenant. We need God to be just and merciful so that we know that when we practice justice and mercy, we are acting together with God as God's partners in the world. We need that now, particularly because we're a generation acharei mot. For whatever reasons, the memory, the reality of the Holocaust has been extended as a major force in our culture and in our people far longer than anyone would have predicted 20 or 30 years ago. The single most popular course that any Jewish studies professor can offer at any university is a course on Holocaust. Courses on Zionism, by the way, are not at all in the same league in terms of appeal. We cannot escape the lengthening shadow of the Holocaust. It stands as a mountain in front of people that they can't get past, many of them, in terms of belief. And we live acharei mot, and many of us, of course, deal with personal tragedies. And I think especially for a young person, but not only for a young person, because many older people are now in the position of those younger people because they are not full members of their own community. They're not at home in their tradition. They don't know the resources their tradition holds out to them. So they confront personal tragedy, or they deal with the collective tragedy of human history and find it impossible to go on with belief in ultimate good, or justice, or truth, or God. And it seems to me that those of us who live in this time live in that hyphen we got to experience because of last Shabbos' double portion, the hyphen between acharei mot and kedoshim, that precisely our task, our blessing, our mission, our privilege is to try to fill the commandment, the possibility of being holy in the face of death. To me, the most meaningful part of this portion of acharei mot is verse 5 of chapter 18, where God makes it clear through Moses that the point of all these laws, V'shmartem et chokotai v'et mishpatai, asher yaseh otam ha'adam v'chai bahem, acharei mot. And we are a force of life. And practicing holiness, which means, yes, ethics, but ethics with the awareness of standing before God, is a life force. I don't know the politics of American Jews when it comes to Israel. They're complex. I think I understand, though, the theology of American Jews when it comes to Israel, which is rather simple and as deep into the Jewish soul as it goes. The theology of American Jews about Israel is Am Yisrael Chai. That's what Israel is to American Jews. Am Yisrael Chai. They tried to kill us. They did a good job. They killed a third of us. But damn it, here we are, and we're not just alive, we're thriving, and we're not going to let this happen again. That's as deep as it gets in the American Jewish kitchkas, heart, soul, mind. And we, in American Jewry, are also an example of Am Yisrael Chai, a thriving Jewish community for all of the problems, for all the assimilation, for all the anti-Semitism, a community of great achievement, which daily is putting out incredible contributions to this Jewish project of adding Kedusha to the world. So I come to a theology which says, as Deuteronomy says, yeah, understand that Nistarot belong to the Lord our God. Okay, the Nistarot belong to the Lord our God. But thank God Deuteronomy doesn't stop there. Haniglot lanu uvanenu adolam la'asot et kol divrei Torah hazot. So in other words, in this life, you don't get to know what you want to know. Even Moses doesn't get to know what he wants to know. But you get what you need to go on. You have what you need to do good with. You have a community. You have a tradition. You have your mind. You have your experience. You've got love. You've got the ability to add justice and mercy to the world. And you've got the presence of God guaranteeing this process and standing there with you every step of the way as you engage in it. Thank you.